the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It's a couple of weeks to the election, and looking at the headlines today, there's a certain, what Umberto Eco used to call hyperreality to the world we seem to live in. On CNN, there's a picture of one of the presidential candidates working in McDonald's alongside the beginnings of a major war in the Middle East. It's hard to prioritize, and the Umberto Eco notion of hyperreality seems to be heightened in October 2024. One wonders what the future has in store. And certainly the element of hyperreality is playing out in nonfiction too. We're doing a show today with our favorite literary critic, Bethanne Patrick, book critic of the Los Angeles Times. As I've often joked on the show, and it's not really a joke, I think it's true, the best read woman in America. We're going to do two shows in October, one on new nonfiction books, one on fiction. We're going to begin with nonfiction, Bethanne. And I wonder whether this idea of hyperreality plays out in nonfiction. One of the books that perhaps we might begin with, Abbott Carla's Eden Undone. Abbott's actually been on our show before with her previous book, seems to deal with the hyperreal nature of the world, except the difference with Carla's book is it was almost 100 years ago. So maybe hyperreality has always been around.
Well, that is so true, Andrew. It is great to be back. Glad to be here. And I do want to say one thing before I talk about Abbott Collar's really, really interesting book, which is that hyperreality and Umberto Eco. I experienced it once myself, drinking martinis with the great writer at 10 in the morning here in DC at the Jefferson Hotel.
I'm a hard person to make envious, but I am envious of that.
It was pretty great, let me tell you. One of those bucket list moments. But hyperreality is what it feels like right now, as you pointed out, with some of the things that are going on in our political arena, things that are going on geopolitically, etc. And Abbott's new book, Eden Undone, is about a very strange little utopia that formed on an island way, way down in the Pacific, the South Pacific, in the 1920s and 1930s. There are descendants of those would-be utopians still alive today. And it reminded me a lot of, there was a children's book years ago called The 21 Balloons about a place called Krakatoa and how people tried to make their ideal world. And this book reminded me so much of it. It is a fantastic read. And yet, as Abbott points out, Karen Abbott is the other, if you will, the real name of Abbott Collar. She writes under both names, and that is not a secret. But Abbott's note at the beginning tells you, look, everything in this book is true. There was a German psychiatrist or a doctor and his patient. There was a noblewoman and her pair of lovers. There was another pair, a married couple. There were all of these people.
Yeah, and the subtitle of the book, A True Story of Sex, Murder, and Utopia at the Dawn of World War II.
Yes.
In other words, sometimes you have stories and sometimes you have true stories. And as the cliche goes, Bethanne, you can't make this kind of stuff up.
You cannot make this kind of stuff up. This is a story of a murder that really hasn't been solved. And let me tell you, collar kicks it at the end. The end, any reader who goes to
Yeah,
even
you're not going to
ending,
give the end away, I hope.
no, of course not. But it's a great read. I highly recommend that you pick it up for any time this fall. It is just terrific.
Yeah, it might take your mind off our current hyperreality.
There you go.
Another book which seems even more sort of perfectly suited to our is there such a word as our Econian moment? I'm not sure I'm making that one up.
I'm not sure if it's a real world word, but I'll go with the neologism.
Okay, well, our hyper real world is a book about the former Queen of England,
Yes.
Queen I grew up with, Queen Elizabeth II. It's by Craig Brown, A Voyage Around the Queen. But is it in itself, is it fair to call this a hyper real treatment of Queen Elizabeth?
Brown had previously given us 99 glimpses of Princess Margaret, and that was a much shorter book, which probably makes sense because of their impact on the world. But it was his way of putting together a biography in almost an autofiction kind of way. Of course, it's not his autobiography, but it's taking documents, anecdotes, newspaper articles, mashing them all together and giving us a look at these women who did grow up in, as you say, a kind of hyper reality. That is the only way really to describe the British monarchy in the 20th and 21st centuries. And something that I really appreciated about Q, A Voyage Around the Queen, because it's a little bit overblown, it's a little bit bottom heavy, kind of like the yacht that the royal yacht, I believe it was called Britannia.
I think it was it Britannia or Balmoral? Anyway, yeah.
I can't remember, but before it was decommissioned, let's say, it was a little bottom heavy. And Brown,
We're not going to make any jokes about bottom heavy royals, are we?
No, I'm not. But I am going to say that I think Brown, if I'm going to borrow a phrase from your countryman Simon Cowell, is a bit self-indulgent. However,
yeah. So you didn't care for the book?
No, I cared for it very much. It did get a little bit long. However, here's what I want to say about the book. Brown's best point and best understanding of the Queen is that she becomes a mirror for whomever meets her. She is almost a reflection. And so many people become flustered in her presence. And I think it's because she understands that the real function of a monarch is not to have a personality, not to have an affect, but to simply be there as a symbol.
That's an important point. And thinking about the current situation in the United States,
yes,
perhaps one of the presidential candidates himself, and that gives away who we're talking about, he recognizes that, I mean, America, of course, doesn't have a monarchy. But might it be fair to say, particularly in the context of the Brown piece about Queen Elizabeth, that Trump's running as a monarch or a wannabe monarch, and Harris, I almost forgot her name, is running as a prime minister?
Good heavens, you almost forgot Kamala Harris's name. Shame on you. But I would say that is a pretty good metaphor for what's going on right now. I think Donald Trump is a man who would like to be king, and it's because he doesn't really understand what being a king entails. And Kamala Harris is running as a prime minister because a prime minister actually does the work of governing. And
maybe they should run together. Maybe that's what we need.
Please. It's too close to the election. Too close, Andrew.
Yeah, well, this is going to come out before the election. So,
yes, it's true. It's true, but
we won't speculate. But certainly the understanding this, it's not just the British obsession. I mean, one of the things about America, which is always so, again, hyper real or surreal to me, is the American obsession with the Queen. Does Brown get into this? Why are the Americans so obsessed with the royal family?
He does get into it a bit, and he gets into it so that we can understand what it is that England cherishes so much about the Queen, or cherished, I should say, sadly. You know, one of the things we can't separate, I think, when we talk about Queen Elizabeth II, is that we cannot separate her long reign from her parents' decision to remain in London during the Blitz. That is something that has not been forgotten. There are still people alive who very much remember it. And it is what kept her so respected and admired, even through all of her terrible troubles, the annus horribilis, etc. But you have to remember, this is a woman who had a very powerful position, and yet there are ramifications of what happened in her life that really even affect us here in the United
Yeah.
States. Epstein scandal. You know, there was just a Saturday Night Live sketch last night that referenced Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein. So, you know, there are things that went on in the royal family that are still
Yeah,
affecting.
and in the context of her parents remaining in London, of course, it needs to be understood in the context also of her uncle's disgrace, his association with Nazi Germany and all the rest of it. Anyway, if America does have a royal institution, Bethanne, then of course it's the Supreme Court, where you get appointed for life. And one of the authors on your list of nonfiction books for the fall this year is Ketanji Brown Jackson's new memoir. Lovely one. I actually went to see Jackson speak in San Francisco recently, and I was astonished by the size of the crowd. There had to have been about 2,000 people there. She's obviously a remarkable woman, but is there a, shall we say, an American royal quality to Jackson, do you think, as a person, perhaps?
I do think as a person, and this is why, first of all, Lovely One isn't something she is anointing herself with. That is
anything but. I mean, it's
no, Ketanji is, that's what her name means. And I just think that is lovely in and of itself, that that's what her parents chose as her name. She is a woman of remarkable courage, restraint, intelligence, and wit. One of the things I loved in this book is, you know, some of the opinions. She'll even bring in something like a children's book, like If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, and it's always perfectly apt. I mean, this is a woman who is so well educated, so well read. She is exactly the kind of person that we all want on our Supreme Court. And we want more people like Justice Jackson on our Supreme Court. What I found interesting about this book is that it is so, it's a book about gratitude. It's not a book about struggles. I mean, she does not neglect to talk
yeah, it's
about
not an American dream book, and she's not an American dream. She doesn't present herself in an American dream narrative, which
exactly.
certainly some people might, given her history.
No, she has a very, very clear vision of who she is, what she can do, what her position is, and I was very happy to read it. I haven't read the Connie Chung memoir yet, which I understand is extremely good, and I do look forward to it. But I read Lovely One and think that it is a terrific choice for anyone who cares about our highest court, and also any woman will appreciate.
Yeah, I was really struck with her speech. She was incredibly, incredibly humble and smart and funny and all the rest of it. I haven't read the book, but she talked a lot in the speech about her daughter and her sort of half regret at throwing herself into the law, given that she has I don't know whether you would call her a learning disabled daughter, a daughter certainly with some issues and struggles. Does that come up a lot in the book, her relationship with her daughter and what has happened?
It doesn't come up a lot because this is a book in which she is trying to show you her entire self. And so much of that is about her work. I dare say that any woman who has children and reaches the kind of professional success that Justice Jackson has will have stories about this. Most women I know who are also mothers know that even if you devoted yourself 100% to a child with struggles, that doesn't mean that you can eliminate those struggles or fix them. It takes a village. And so I think she puts it in proper context, but it is very moving to hear from someone at her level that there are regrets, because, I mean, the thing about regrets is we all have them. It's how we move forward that matters.
Yeah, we were just talking about our mutual children.
Yes.
Speaking of mothers, I'm sorry for my loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America by two authors, Rebecca Little and Colleen Long. What do they tell us about parenting, or the tragedy of parenting in America today?
Well, what they tell us is that we have got to bring all of this out in the open. One of the delimitations that they made is they decided we're not going to talk about, late term abortions.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's the subtitle of the book is An Urgent Examination of Reproductive Care in America. So this
Right.
is a
They wanted.
nonfiction book about the abortion issue in America.
Sorry, yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. They didn't want to talk about the extremes. They didn't want to talk about, infertility or, like I said, late term, abortions or terminations. They wanted to talk about the gray area. And I just said any woman who is also a mother understands that you have regrets when raising your children. Almost every woman I know who has children, and many women I know who don't, have experienced stillbirth, miscarriage, abortion, termination for medical reasons, ectopic pregnancies, all of these things. And there's a lot of grief and mourning that go along with all of them that complicates talking about them. And what matters to these authors is that when you don't talk about this stuff because you are holding things back out of grief or out of, respect for someone, then we don't decide what works. We don't decide what's really best for women in America in terms of reproductive rights. And so they want to say, look, I'm sorry for my loss. They both had stillbirths. They experienced those, which is really terrible. I know women who have experienced stillbirth. I know women who have gone through all of these things, including myself. I had a miscarriage years ago between my two full-term pregnancies and healthy children. And it really couldn't be talked about much at the time in the community where I was living. And people thought they were being kind, but all you want is acknowledgement when you experience a loss like that. You want someone to say, this is terrible. You want someone to say, no wonder you're having a hard time. You don't want people to say it's God's will, or you'll have another baby, or, pick yourself up and, just get on with it.
And I understand the politics here, but
Yeah.
I know this is an incredibly controversial subject in America. But is this political? I mean, I would guess that
No, it's
conservatives,
not.
evangelical conservatives,
The book is
given
not
their
political.
what some people see as their fetish of life and birth,
Yes.
that they would be even more traumatized by stillborn children than progressives.
Well, this is what Little and Long had decided. They did not write a political book. They want this to be a book that politicians will read and learn from, but they did not want to get into the politics. So this is not a book that has a screed in it or a specific message. It's a book about the real experiences of women who have gone through these difficult pregnancies and the other things around them. And they did a lot of interviews, and they did control for things like, look, if someone's coming forward and telling their story, then there's a certain bias there. Because, of course, for every woman who is willing to say, this happened to me, there is a woman, and believe me, I'm not a statistics maven, I'm just a book maven, but there's going to be a woman who is not sharing her story. So this cannot be a book that is comprehensive. It's simply a book that's very thoughtful and very much focused on the experience of reproduction.
Right, and
And
I think perhaps going back to the Ketanji
Mhm.
Jackson book, I mean, her joy of having a child can be read in juxtaposition, in contrast with the Little and Long book.
I think
Let's go
so.
back to American royalty. Another real American royal is Al Pacino. He has a new memoir out, Sonny Boy. I read a little bit of it in The Guardian, and I was really struck with not only how interesting, obviously, his life is, but how well he writes. Is this a well-written book? I thought it was really the
It's
bit I
very
read.
well written, but it is, he did write it with, and oh, I'm sorry, I should have brought this along with me. It's a well-known writer who is his ghostwriter.
No,
However,
it's not. It's what is it with ghostwriters, Bethanne? Should they always be mentioned? I mean, if Pacino didn't really write this, shouldn't it be by Al Pacino and X?
I think it should be. I think it's high time we acknowledged the ghostwriters. But here's the thing, and I'll be really quick about this, Andrew. You know, there's a ghostwriter who sometimes is mentioned, as in the case of Prince Harry and J.R. Moehringer for Spare. Sometimes ghostwriters don't want to be mentioned, or the person doesn't want the ghostwriter mentioned. Now, I have seen it's oh shoot, we'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. But in this case, it's not on the cover. And I was going to say, the thing is, there are also collaborators. So sometimes now you will find that two people work on a book together and they will both have their names on it. The way, for instance, James Patterson works with various writers, including.
Yeah, I've seen that. But
You've
sometimes
seen that,
when
but
you interview the notable person, they don't want to talk about the other person.
no.
Anyway,
However,
let's
I
get
want
to
to,
the heart of the matter.
yeah, what I
Pacino
want to
and
say about
the
Al
bit I
Pacino.
read in The Guardian, which I think has been making news in its own right, is the story about being hired by Coppola for the Godfather. This was a remarkable story, how he almost got fired and how
Yes.
nervous he was. And in a sense, he might have even been pleased had he been fired.
He really would have been pleased in some ways. But I also want to say, before I forget, we were talking about reproduction and motherhood, and Al Pacino
Yeah.
has
84 years old, quite an
84
achievement.
years old, has a new child born last year.
Yeah.
And so that is an interesting thing to see him. He says this is something that is giving him life. What Sonny Boy will show you is what a life he's had. He has had a truly American life, coming up from the South Bronx and walking along the streets of Manhattan, reciting Shakespeare, really working on his craft. He is not someone who is a fly by night at all. He is really
Put it
interesting.
mildly, yeah.
Yeah, he's hot-headed. There are, things he regrets, talking about regrets again. But, and this goes back to what you said about enjoying that excerpt, I think that his voice comes through beautifully on every page. And that is not, it's not an accident. That's really great ghostwriting when you bring that spirit, that cadence, someone's diction through like that. This really is Al Pacino talking to you. It's remarkably.
Yeah, one of the stories, and maybe this sort of
Mhm.
touches again on the relationship between nonfiction and fiction. After Godfather came out, the first Godfather, Pacino said he was in New York and he was waiting at a traffic light and he was about to cross, and a young, attractive woman came up to him and said, "Hello, Michael." Of course, Michael Corleone still remains his most famous representation, perhaps amongst the most celebrated figures in the whole history of American cinema. As an actor, Bethanne, again, the cliche is that actors don't have selves; they simply are somebody else. Does Pacino get into this? Did he ever feel as if he was Michael Corleone or some of the other remarkable characters he represented? In a sense, they're all, perhaps, maybe he turned the whole cliche on its head. They all became versions of Al Pacino.
You know, that is probably one of the most pithy things I've heard about Al Pacino. I do think that his greatest roles, including From Scent of a Woman and all of his other movies, and why can't Scarface, that's what I was trying to think of. When you think of Scarface, which is an amazing movie. It took me years to watch it. I thought I was going to be really turned off by the violence. And instead, I was mesmerized by what he did with that character. And how do you think of Scarface or Michael Corleone or anything that he's been in without thinking of Al Pacino? So I agree with you about that. And I do agree with you also that he melted in and out of those characters, and his ways of getting into a character are part of what makes this an amazing book. Now, what makes it less amazing is the way you see he treats the women in his life. It's terrible all the way through. He is someone, and without getting into a lot of gender politics.
And this is his best case scenario, is it? This is him talking. God knows what it'd be like if other people would talk.
Exactly. This is someone who decided that his work, l'état c'est moi, his work is himself. And so Sonny Boy is really, it is about Sonny Boy.
Did he have a mother who had idolized him? Do we have any psychological roots for this?
Well, it's his grandmother who called him Sonny Boy. So it was his grandparents.
There's always a grandmother or a mother behind these.
Yes, exactly. Same thing with Bruce Springsteen.
Who?
Bruce Springsteen in his memoir.
Although I think Bruce Springsteen,
I'm not trying to say they're the
have
same.
A little bit more humility, for better or worse, than Pacino. The other bit I read, and we could spend a whole show on this, was Pacino's story of meeting Brando on the set of Godfather, and Brando being in a fake hospital, I guess, and eating his chicken dinner with his hands. Is there a Brando quality to Pacino? Does he inherit that Brando insanity or reality? I don't know what you would how you would describe it. And again, there should be an adjective associated with Brando.
I like that we're talking about hyper reality through all of these books, because we have one more. And
I know we got two more, and I got
oh my goodness, but anyway, yes, I think Pacino has some of that swagger, and I always think, because of their age and the movies that they were in at the same time, I always think of Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, and they couldn't be more different in so many ways. But I also think that there is a certain 1970s swagger to some of these actors, like you said, and it's so American. It's not just Brando inheriting.
I mean, it's Nicholson, of course, but De Niro. I mean, they were all friends. There's going to be lots of books on that. Speaking of,
it's the young cowboys, the non-Western cowboys in some way.
Yeah, well, speaking of cowboys and Hoffman, that's another subject.
Yes.
Hyperreality. One man who has perhaps created his own hyperreality, you couldn't make up his life, is Bob Woodward. He seems to come out with a new book every year or two. He's made a fortune on lots of fronts, recently out of Donald Trump. I've always thought he's a little bit of a parody of himself. What's your take on Woodward and this latest book, War?
Well, here's what I will say. There are a couple of things that are indisputable about Bob Woodward. First of all, that he is...
Speaking of the 70s, excuse the interruption, speaking of the 70s, of course.
Speaking of the 70s, you know, of course, he is an icon along with his colleague Carl Bernstein or Bernstein. And I'm really bad at knowing which people prefer Stein and which prefer Steen. So forgive me, Carl Bernstein. Anyway, they are icons, especially because of the Watergate journalism they did that was, of course, made famous in All the King's Men. But Woodward has had his own path in journalism. And here's the other indisputable thing about him. He does his homework, or he has someone do the homework for him. He has a huge note at the beginning of War acknowledging his seemingly tireless personal assistant. And I thought that was really interesting. The notes,
at least he acknowledges her, and I said her. That was probably
that is correct, of course. And
I hope he behaves. He doesn't seem to have. He seems to be someone who behaves himself around young women, though. Woodward, is he?
Oh yeah, I think so. And he's been married for 4 or 5 decades now. He is not a play around kind of guy. I think he's too busy writing and he's too busy reporting. And what I appreciated about War, I'm not sure the central thesis, because it really seems to be a paean to President Biden, but he does allow the reporting to speak. This is not something where he's in it every second. There are so many players in this book, and it's all properly done through interviews and, recordings. He has a long chapter at the beginning that is actually the very, very late transcribed tape of an interview he and Bernstein did in 1989 with a 42-year-old Donald Trump. And
is Woodward, though, living in the past? Does he still think he's covering Nixon and Watergate? Does he understand that something in America has profoundly changed and that Trump isn't Nixon, and the kind of stuff that people were, for better or worse, outraged about Nixon? They're just indifferent on Trump.
I do think he understands that to a certain extent. In no way does this long interview that he gets in there, and he does talk a bit about it, it doesn't set out to criminalize Trump. It doesn't set out to give some kind of takedown, like, here's my new Watergate. That's not what it is. It's a portrait. Everything that Trump says in 1989 damns him. Now that they found the tape of this, I guess Woodward had lost it and finally found it a few years ago.
Yeah, but I wonder again, Woodward and Bernstein brought down Nixon, and these kinds of books, there are so many of them. I mean, obviously the Woodward book has a little bit more heft because of him. They're just writing to an echo chamber. No one who votes for Trump reads these kinds of books, do they?
That is correct. Absolutely. And so I did say, I think the book is a little bit of a paean, not pandering. I don't think that Woodward panders in any way, but I think he does want to show that President Biden has handled war in a different way than Trump would have or than Nixon did. I think he wants to show that Biden really wanted to keep American troops, for example, out of Ukraine, and put measures into place. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, but it is a book about showing, look at these figures in the center of the cover.
Yeah. I don't want to get into this. Maybe we can talk about it another time. But my sense is that Trump's going to win the election because of obviously the two candidates are very close, because of the nonfiction narrative. God, if there is one, is certainly a nonfiction writer, and it's a much more suitable ending, but that's another subject. And also in terms of hyperreality, you mentioned Dustin Hoffman earlier in the context of Al Pacino. Of course, Dustin Hoffman played Woodward in All the President's Men.
Yes.
One of the great films, obviously, about the book and the Nixon scandal.
Yes.
Finally, so there's a lot of hyper reality there. Finally, the final book, which is also kind of hyper real, comes back to a subject that you and I have talked about many, many times in America, race. The final book in this nonfiction fall summer roundup is Sarah Lewis's The Unseen Truth: When Race Changed Sight in America. What does that mean?
Well, Sarah Lewis is an art historian, among other things, a professor at Harvard who founded the, I hope I get this correct, the Visualization and Justice Initiative. And this is a book about the ways in which photographs, maps, paintings, portrayals, sketches, all of this kind of media has been used in the United States since around the Civil War to change the way we look at other people. And it's the most important book on this list. I'm glad we've left it till last because I do want to underscore how meaningful The Unseen Truth is. There are so many things I could tell you about this book, but what I want to get to is the idea of maps and how a certain sector of the American elite, having a sort of obsession with Caucasia, which is actually Circassia in Russia, near Russia, that this obsession with Caucasians being a race that led to, quote unquote, white people, and how that changed the maps that we look at and even the globes that we use to educate people, people who we decided would be called different races. We would have this division between Black and white because, of course, there was a pure race that came from this Caucasus region. There is no such thing as a white Caucasian. Actually, if you look at people from the Circassian area, they're probably slightly darker, maybe more akin to some of the people who live in northern regions of Canada and Greenland. And, it just doesn't exist. And so Lewis is trying to say, we have been hornswoggled. She even talks about P.T. Barnum and the way he would put these women into sort of fright wigs and say they were beautiful Circassian ladies. And it was sort of to other them because these wigs would look like, I guess, what we might call an afro today.
So it's more hyper reality. It's almost,
yes, it is. It's totally more hyper
a
reality.
cartographical hyper reality. Is that what
Yes.
you're writing about?
Yes, but cartographical, and also the way we wound up seeing people who were not quote unquote Americans, that means white Americans, portrayed even in Winslow Homer. You see paintings Lewis shows us where there is a narrative of a person with dark skin that is very different than the same narrative might be of a person with lighter
It sounds
skin.
an interesting book. It's published by Harvard University Press,
Yes.
an academic press. Sometimes these books are these academic books,
No, this is
representation and race are a bit dense.
I could not put it down. I could not put it down. It is so fascinating. It is not a dry academic tome. Yes, there are a few things in it that you might have to stop and think, oh, how do I put A and B together? But it is so readable. It has tons and tons of interesting research in it. It is a book that will change. It's as necessary as Isabel Wilkerson's Cast.
Wow. Well, you put yourself in a hole here because I always end, as you know, in our summaries with a choice of one book, but I'm guessing that this is it. Sarah Lewis is The Unseen Truth: When Race Changed Sight in America. Is this your top nonfiction book for fall 2024?
It is.
Well, we are Gonna also do a show on fiction, and I'm not sure whether the fiction books will keep up with the nonfiction. But Bethanne, Patrick, as always, huge pleasure, honor. You've done all the legwork on these fascinating 7 nonfiction books. We will see you again in the next few days with a show about fiction in America in 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I step on